Ernest Nagel, Defending Atheism, Video 1. In this video, we're going to consider parts 1 and 2 of Defending Atheism by Ernest Nagel. We're going to also work through the first two paragraphs of part 3. This is the cosmological or the first cause argument. Video 2 is going to cover the rest of part 3, which is the ontological argument. And video 3 will cover part 4, which is the teleological argument, or the argument from design. Video 4 will cover the last two paragraphs of part 5, which is the argument from religious experience. And video 5 will cover part 7, Nagel's positive doctrine of atheism. All right, let's begin. I must begin by stating what sense I'm attaching to the word atheism, and how I'm construing the theme of this essay. I shall understand by atheism a critique and a denial of the major claims of all varieties of theism. And by theism I shall mean the view which holds, as one writer has expressed it, that the heavens and earth and all that they contain owe their existence and continuance in existence to the wisdom and will of a supreme, self-consistent, omnipotent, omniscient, righteous, and benevolent being, who is distinct from and independent of what he's created. Several things immediately follow from these definitions. So here we see by theism, Nagel identifies that he means the belief in an omnipotent, omniscient being that's all good. This being's distinct and independent of the world that the being created. And by atheism, he means a critique and a denial of the major claims of all varieties of theism. In the first place, atheism is not necessarily an irreligious concept, for theism is just one among many views concerning the nature and origin of the world. The denial of theism is logically compatible with a religious outlook upon life, and is in fact characteristic of some of the great historical religions. For as readers of this volume will know, early Buddhism is a religion which does not subscribe to any doctrine about a god, and there are pantheistic religions and philosophies which, because they deny that God is a being separate from and independent of the world, are not theistic in the sense of the word explained above. So, here, Nagel's pointing out that the version of atheism that he's developing isn't necessarily against all religion. For example, early Buddhism is a religion which does not subscribe to any doctrine about God, and so would be consistent with Nagel's atheism. Similarly, any religion that believed that everything is a part of God, which is also known as pantheism, and so God is not independent from the world, would also not conflict with Nagel's understanding of atheism. The second point to note is that atheism is not to be identified with sheer unbelief, or with disbelief in some particular creed or a religious group. Thus, a child who's received no religious instruction and has never heard about God is not an atheist, for he's not denying any theistic claims. Similarly, an adult who's withdrawn from the faith of his fathers without reflection, or because of frank indifference to any theological issue, is also not an atheist. For such an adult is not challenging theism, and is not professing any views on the subject. So here, Nagel's also careful to point out that atheism is not simply about sheer unbelief, or with disbelief in some particular creed of a religious group. So, following from this, a child who's received no religious instruction and has never heard about God is not an atheist, because she's not denying any theistic claims. Similarly, an adult who's withdrawn from their faith without reflection, or because of frank indifference to any theological issue, is also not an atheist. This is because this kind of adult is not challenging theism. Instead, they're just not professing any views on atheism at all. So we can see that for Nagel, to be an atheist requires an active critique and attempt to deny the major claims of theism. All right, let's move on to part 2. So in part 2, According to Nagel, he says that arguments for atheism fall into two major groups. The first group hold that the theistic doctrine is meaningful, but reject it either on the grounds that the positive evidence in favor of theism is insufficient, or that the negative evidence against theism is quite overwhelming. So this group of atheists agree that when you say something like, God exists, this has meaning, but we can't affirm that God exists is true, right? Either because the evidence is insufficient to do so, or because the evidence against this position is very overwhelming. The other group that Nagel talks about is the group that holds that the theistic thesis is not even meaningful, and they reject it as either nonsense, and we saw this in air, or as being literally meaningless, but interpreting it as a symbolic rendering of human ideals, thus reading the theistic thesis in a sense that most believers in theism would disavow. Right, and we'll remember that Ayer also mentioned this kind of thinking when he talks about when I say thunder means that God is angry, all I can actually mean on this view is something like it's thundering, okay? And generally speaking, when we understand the theistic thesis in this way, most believers would not agree that that's what they meant. As far as the second group, Nagel's not going to consider the second group at all in the essay. He's only going to consider group 1. Nagel also makes the point that historically speaking, arguing against theism has been as much about combating injustices perpetuated by religious institutions as it has been about simply arguing that God doesn't exist. And he puts this really nicely when he says, the refutation of theism has thus seemed to many an indispensable step, not only towards liberating men's minds from the superstition, but also towards achieving a more equitable reordering of society. All right, let's move on to part 3. And this is where Nagel presents the argument. One of the oldest intellectual defenses of theism is the cosmological argument, also known as the argument from a first cause. Briefly put, the argument runs as follows. Every event must have a cause, hence an event A must have as cause some event B, which in turn must have a cause C, and so on. But if there's no end to this backward progression of causes, the progression will be infinite, and in the opinion of those who use this argument, an infinite series of actual events is unintelligible and absurd. Hence, there must be a first cause, and this first cause is God, the initiator of all change in the universe. All right, so we're pretty familiar with this version of the cosmological argument, I think. Every event must have a cause. But if there's no end to this backward progression of causes, the progression will be infinite. An infinite series of actual events is unintelligible and absurd, so there must be a first cause, and this first cause is God, the initiator of all change in the universe. All right, let's look at Nagel's objection. The argument is an ancient one, and it's impressed many generations of exceptionally keen minds. The argument is nonetheless a weak reed on which to rest the theistic thesis. Let us waive any question concerning the validity of the principle that every event has a cause. For though the question is important, its discussion would lead us far afield. However, if the principle is assumed, it's surely incongruous to postulate a first cause as a way of escaping from the coils of an infinite series. For if everything must have a cause, why does not God require one for his own existence? The standard answer is that he does not need any, because he is self-caused. But if God can be self-caused, why cannot the world be self-caused? Why do we require a God transcending the world to bring the world into existence and to initiate change in it? On the other hand, The supposed inconceivability and absurdity of an infinite series of regressive causes will be admitted by no one whose competent familiarity with the modern mathematical analysis of infinity. The cosmological argument does not stand up under scrutiny. All right, let's take a look at this. So we'll start here, and we see that let us waive any questions concerning the validity of the principle that every event has a cause, for though the question's important, its discussion would lead us far afield. Here, Nagel points out that although wondering about the question, does every event really have to have a cause, is important, he's going to set it aside. Even if we accept that every event does have a cause, this actually doesn't help avoid the problem of an infinite chain of causes. And this is followed by an objection that we've seen before. For if everything must have a cause, why does not God require a cause for his existence? The standard answer is that he does not need any, because he's self-caused. But if God can be self-caused, why cannot the world be self-caused? What do we require of God transcending the world to bring the world into existence and to initiate change in it? This leads to the end of the passage. On the other hand, the supposed inconceivability and absurdity of an infinite series of regressive causes will be admitted by no one who has competent familiarity with the modern mathematical analysis of infinity. The cosmological argument does not stand up under scrutiny. So here, we see Nagel claiming that the modern mathematical analysis of infinity shows that an infinite series of regressive causes might be something we can accept. And if we can accept that there's no problem with an infinite series, then this is no longer a problem for the argument.